blood has a different color when evening begins to swallow a village. In the failing light, it darkens against rough timber, gathers black beneath overturned stools, and disappears into the mud between abandoned cottages while flies circle where voices should have been. Somewhere in Velen, a door creaks on a loose hinge. A frightened child remains hidden among the ruins, and the faint shape of a witcher medallion rests against the chest of the man responsible. It is an image we will return to much later because the dark history of the cat school is not really a story about one massacre, nor even about one generation of witchers who learned to kill men as readily as monsters. It is a story about the moment when the difference between hunter, mercenary, victim, and murderer became so uncertain that an entire name could begin to sound like an accusation. You can let the road unfold slowly from here. This is a calm journey through Witcher lore, meant to be followed as closely as you wish, or simply allowed to fade into the edges of sleep. If you have been returning for these journeys, leave the number of the night you have reached. If this is your first, simply write night 1. Then listen for a moment to what is absent from that ruined village. No contract being negotiated, no villagers arguing over coin, no monster shrieking from the woods. Only the aftermath and the distant sound of wind moving through leaves. The man Geralt will eventually find there wears a cat medallion, and that single detail seems at first to explain everything. By the age of The Witcher 3, the cats carry a reputation for unstable temperaments, hired killings, and witchers who have strayed far from the traditional path. Yet reputations are dangerous things in Sapkowski's world because they turn complicated lives into convenient shapes. Before we decide what the cat school became, we have to ask a harder question. How much of the history people confidently tell about it was ever established in the original books at all? Why does the cat school seem to possess such an enormous history when Andrzej Sapkowski actually tells us remarkably little about its institution? The novels never hand you a chronicle of its founding in the manner of a royal genealogy, nor do they walk you through a great cat fortress with named masters explaining centuries of tradition. There is no long book canon account describing the first cat witchers gathering beneath a banner, choosing their emblem, and setting down laws for generations to follow. Sapkowski gives fragments instead, and the fragments are darker because they arrive without comforting explanations. The cat appears first as a sign attached to witchers whose stories are already damaged, interrupted, or dead. Notice the structure of that choice. Before the reader is allowed to know the institution, the reader is made to encounter its reputation. One of the clearest early traces waits around the neck of a man who is not a witcher at all. In The Tower of the Swallow, Leo Bonhart enters Ciri's story as a professional killer whose physical ability is terrifying enough that even experienced fighters recognize what he represents. He carries 3 witcher medallions among his possessions, bearing the signs of a wolf, a cat, and a griffin, and he claims that he killed the witchers who once wore them. The novels never stop to provide biographies for those dead men, and Sapkowski never confirms every detail of Bonhart's boasts, simply because Bonhart says them. What matters immediately is the image. Tokens associated with monster hunters have become trophies hanging from a human killer. Long before we are given a living cat whose character can be judged, an unknown cat has already entered the saga as someone who lost a final fight. Bonhart's trophies also tell us something easily missed when later adaptations and games make the Witcher schools feel like fully mapped institutions. By the time of series journey, different Witcher traditions clearly exist beyond Geralt's wolves, but the books are far less interested in cataloging them than in showing what remains after those traditions have begun to fade. Kaer Morhen itself is already a diminished place in Blood of Elves, inhabited by only a handful of Witchers when Ciri arrives there for training. Vesemir is old. The fortress bears the scars of an attack that devastated the Witchers generations earlier, and the knowledge required to create new Witchers is no longer comfortably available to the men who winter there. Sapkowski's world introduces the profession when much of its heroic age has already ended. The dead cat behind Bonhart's medallion therefore belongs to a larger pattern. We often meet Witcher history through ruins, survivors, and things no one can fully reconstruct. That matters because later lore can create the illusion that every empty space has a definite answer. The games greatly expand the identities of the schools, their equipment, individual Witchers, and the surviving traces they left across the continent, and those additions will become essential once our story reaches Aiden, Jad Carradine, Kian, Gaetan, and the Cat School gear. But the games are a sequel continuity written by CD Projekt Red after the end of Sapkowski's saga, not missing chapters secretly lifted from his novels. When we enter that material, we will call it what it is and allow it to stand on its own considerable strengths. For now, the book foundation is narrower and stranger. The cats are known not because Sapkowski carefully explains their bureaucracy, but because particular men carrying that identity cast unusually long shadows. The clearest living shadow appears in Season of Storms through a Witcher named Brehon. He is called the Cat of Yellow, and the title does not carry the warmth of a nickname given between companions beside a winter fire. His name is associated with slaughter, with a place where the work of a professional monster hunter turned into violence against human beings. When Geralt encounters him, Brehon is not presented as an exotic representative sent to explain another school to the reader. He appears as a warning made flesh, a Witcher recognizable enough that Geralt understands exactly what kind of reputation stands before him. And here the cat ceases to be merely a symbol on one of Bonhart's trophies. It becomes a question Geralt has to face while the man wearing it can still answer back. Before that meeting can be understood, remember what a Witcher normally represents in the books. Geralt was subjected to mutation as a child, survived the trial of the grasses, trained with blades, learned the habits of creatures ordinary people barely understand, and spent his adult life traveling toward screams that sensible travelers move away from. His profession exists because the continent is inhabited by things such as strigas, kikimoras, bruxae, ghouls, drowners, and curses that soldiers with ordinary steel cannot always solve. Witchers use heightened senses, potions dangerous to ordinary humans, specialized swordsmanship, and a limited set of signs to survive those encounters. Their skills are not theatrical ornaments. Almost every advantage they possess was created so that a human-shaped body could stand near something inhuman and have a chance of walking away. The uncomfortable possibility behind the cats is therefore simple. Every skill useful for surviving a monster can also become frightening when the target is another person. Sapkowski never allows that possibility to remain theoretical for long. Geralt himself kills human beings throughout the stories, sometimes because they attack him, sometimes because refusing to intervene would leave innocent people dead, and sometimes because the famous neutrality he claims proves impossible to maintain. The Blaviken affair in The Lesser Evil leaves him known as the Butcher of Blaviken after he kills Renfri's men in the marketplace, even though the circumstances behind the bloodshed are far more complicated than the name eventually suggests. That reputation follows Geralt precisely because townspeople remember bodies more easily than moral calculations. A Witcher's public identity can therefore be reshaped by a single violent afternoon, regardless of what actually happened before the first sword was drawn. This becomes crucial when we approach the cats, because the world judging them is already a world that can turn Geralt of Rivia into a butcher with one word. But there is an important difference between a bad reputation and a false one. Brehin's darkness is not simply gossip produced by frightened peasants who dislike yellow eyes and mutant reflexes. Season of Storms gives Geralt reason to regard him as dangerous, and the massacre connected with Yellow hangs over their meeting before either man needs to draw steel. Bran belongs to the same broad profession as Geralt, yet there is none of the easy fellowship that sometimes exists among the wolves at Kaer Morhen. The two men understand one another's capabilities too well for that. Every small shift of posture carries meaning when each knows how quickly the other can kill. What makes the encounter compelling is that Geralt does not treat Brehin as a monster merely because people call him one, but neither does he pretend that sharing the Witcher's mutations excuses what Brehin has done. There is a colder detail beneath their hostility, one that turns this from a story about an individual murderer into the beginning of something larger. Brehin speaks from outside the security Geralt still possesses because Kaer Morhen is not simply another convenient winter shelter open to every man who carries a Witcher medallion. Geralt can return to Vesemir, to Eskel, to Lambert, to the crumbling walls where the wolves gather when the roads freeze and contracts grow scarce. Brehin has no equivalent refuge available to him there, and the exclusion is not presented as an arbitrary inconvenience. His reputation has consequences even among other Witchers. Here's the first uncomfortable turn in the cat story. Violence can lead to isolation, but once isolation becomes permanent, it can also make the road back from violence increasingly difficult to find. That does not absolve Brehin, and Geralt never offers him such an easy escape. What it does is prevent the cats from becoming a children's tale in which a different medallion means a different species of man. Geralt's own life has already shown that Witchers are capable of killing human beings without thereby becoming indiscriminate murderers, while Brehin forces the more difficult distinction between violence constrained by choice and violence that has slipped beyond restraint. Sapkowski places responsibility in the man rather than allowing mutation, profession, or school to carry all of it for him. A medallion can tell you where someone came from, perhaps who trained him, perhaps which tradition shaped the way he survived. It cannot make the decision his hand makes when the sword is already drawn. And that is where the dark history truly begins, not with a secret laboratory or a lost fortress, but with a living cat standing across from the white wolf and forcing Geralt to decide whether another Witcher has crossed a boundary that should matter even to men created for killing. The question will become harder as we move beyond the books and into the game continuity, where the cats acquire names, contracts, betrayals, tortured bodies, friendships, and entire villages stained with consequences. Some will appear to confirm every ugly rumor surrounding the school. Others will make those rumors look dangerously incomplete. But before Aiden, before Kian, before Gaetan, and the silent houses of Honorton, there is Brahin of Yellow, carrying the first problem we must answer. If the world already believes a cat is a killer, what happens when the cat begins to believe it too?
Why does Brahin sound less like a man defending himself and more like a man who has already decided what kind of creature the world expects him to be? In Season of Storms, his reputation precedes him through the massacre at Yellow, a slaughter serious enough that Geralt does not treat the name as tavern exaggeration. Brahin is dangerous, experienced, and fully aware that other Witchers know what happened there. Yet when he meets Geralt, he does not behave like someone pleading for understanding or trying to reclaim a lost place among his own kind. He speaks with the brittle hostility of a man who has carried exclusion long enough for it to become part of his identity. The Cat of Yellow is frightening, not because he has forgotten what people think of him, but because he remembers it perfectly. The meeting becomes sharper when Brahin turns his attention toward Vizima and King Foltest's cursed daughter. That contract belongs to one of the most famous episodes in Geralt's life, the Striga hunt later recounted in The Witcher, where the princess born of Ada's incestuous union with Foltest emerges from her crypt as a monster, and Geralt chooses to attempt a cure rather than simply kill her. Brahin also wants access to that work, not out of sentimental concern for the princess, but because such contracts carry money, prestige, and the rare possibility of employment worth the risk. Two Witchers therefore stand near the same royal problem, yet only one of them has a path back into the established network of the profession. Geralt can deal with kings, mages, castellans, and old comrades while still remaining the White Wolf. Brahin arrives already marked by yellow. That difference matters because a Witcher's life is never only a sequence of monster fights. Contracts depend on reputation, local rulers, guild hostility, fearful peasants, and whether anyone will trust the mutant standing at the edge of the square long enough to hear his price. Geralt himself spends much of the books enduring suspicion even when he has done nothing wrong, and he repeatedly discovers that people who need Witchers may despise them at the same time. Brahin has all of that working against him before his own violence is added to the calculation. Once a Witcher becomes notorious for killing humans, the profession that already lives on society's margins becomes narrower still. A man who can no longer rely on welcome, trust, or winter shelter is pushed toward a harsher economy where fear itself becomes useful. Here is the cruel irony in Brahin's position. His exclusion can help explain his bitterness without making his crimes any less his own. Sapkowski does not ask you to choose between seeing him as victim or killer because the world of The Witcher rarely grants such clean alternatives. Brahin can have been shaped by hostility and still be responsible for what he did at Yellow.
He can resent Kaer Morhen's closed gates and still remain dangerous enough that those gates were not closed without reason. He can be wronged by the contempt aimed at witchers while also giving frightened people reasons to fear him specifically. The moral pressure comes from holding all of those truths at once. Geralt's response is therefore more revealing than a duel would have been. He does not rush to kill Brehyn simply because another witcher carries a stained name. And this restraint fits the moral core hidden beneath Geralt's habitual claims of neutrality. At the same time, he does not offer sentimental fraternity merely because both men survived mutation and wear medallions. The warning between them is clear. If Brehyn creates another Iello, the traditional reluctance of witchers to spill one another's blood will no longer protect him. That line establishes something crucial about Geralt's ethics. Brotherhood has limits, and those limits begin where repeated atrocity does. Bran's bitterness toward Kaer Morhen deepens that boundary. The old fortress is already a wounded place by the time Ciri reaches it in Blood of Elves. Its halls mostly empty, its numbers diminished, and the knowledge of creating new witchers largely lost to the men still living there. Vesemir, Eskel, Lambert, Geralt, and the others who return for winter preserve a remnant of something that once had far greater reach. To Brehyn, even that remnant represents a kind of belonging he does not possess. A bed beside a fire, familiar stone walls, shared food, and the simple recognition of men who know exactly what a witcher's body has endured are not small things in a profession built on endless roads. Losing access to such a refuge means losing one of the few places where a witcher does not have to explain what he is. That is why Brehyn's anger should not be read merely as wounded pride. A witcher cut off from other witchers loses information, shelter, companionship, and a rare form of institutional memory in a world where the profession itself is fading. Monster knowledge is not just written in books. It passes through scars, remembered contracts, old mistakes, and winter conversations among men who survived what others did not. Geralt benefits repeatedly from that culture, whether at Kaer Morhen or through encounters with other professionals who understand the path. Brehyn's separation from it leaves him more isolated than an ordinary wanderer. His resentment grows inside a life already designed around solitude. Yet Sapkowski refuses the easy conclusion that isolation inevitably produces murder. Geralt is lonely for much of his life, and so is Yennefer, in ways entirely different from a witcher's, while Ciri experiences abandonment severe enough to reshape her identity among the rats. None of those characters are reduced to one inevitable outcome by pain alone. Brehyn remains accountable precisely because other people in the same world suffer and still make different choices. This is one of the quiet moral foundations beneath The Witcher. Circumstance can explain the path to a decision, but it does not erase the hand that finally makes it. The Cat of Iello is tragic only if you preserve that distinction. There is also something structurally important about the way Sapkowski gives us Brehyn after Geralt has already been established. By the time Season of Storms was published, readers knew the White Wolf's habits, compromises, violence, and stubborn ethical limits in extraordinary detail. Brehyn, therefore, does not introduce the concept of a violent witcher. Geralt himself has long since disproved any fantasy that witchers are pacifists. Instead, Brahen tests how far the profession can drift before violence ceases to be part of the work and becomes a new form of identity. He is not Geralt's opposite because he kills. He is Geralt's warning because the reasons for killing have begun to collapse. That distinction becomes especially visible if you compare the Striga contract with Iello. In Vizima, Geralt enters a crypt knowing he may have to kill the cursed princess if the attempt to lift the curse fails. Yet his first goal is to save the human being trapped inside the monster. The risk is enormous, and the outcome is uncertain. But restraint remains part of the contract. Yellow represents the opposite direction. Whatever chain of events led to the massacre, the name survives because restraint failed catastrophically. One encounter shows a witcher standing before a monster and searching for the person inside. The other leaves human bodies behind a witcher whose name has itself become monstrous. This is where the cat reputation begins to acquire its most dangerous shape. Once enough stories like Yellow circulate, every later cat can be interpreted through them before he has done anything at all. A contract dispute becomes suspicious sooner, a temper becomes proof of madness, and a violent confrontation appears to confirm what everyone already believes. That kind of reputation does not need to be entirely false to become destructive. In fact, it becomes more powerful when it contains enough truth to make every exaggeration believable. The school, or at least the name attached to it, starts carrying the weight of each individual's crimes. Brian seems to understand that trap and respond by leaning into it rather than resisting it. There is a psychological surrender hidden beneath the aggression. If every road leads back to the same accusation, then becoming feared can begin to feel more practical than trying to be trusted. Fear makes negotiations shorter. Fear keeps ordinary men cautious. Fear can protect a solitary witcher when fellowship no longer does. But the price is that intimidation gradually becomes easier to use than reputation, and violence easier than belonging. That is the point where Brahen stops being merely one notorious killer and becomes the first real test of the cat school's larger tragedy. The question is no longer whether he committed terrible acts, because the shadow of Yellow is too heavy for that. The question is whether a profession built around dangerous men can survive once one group inside it becomes identified not by monsters slain, but by humans killed. And if the world begins treating every cat as a murderer before the sword is drawn, the next question is even darker. How many of those men will eventually decide there is no reason left to prove the world wrong? If the cats were so often described as unstable, then where did that instability actually come from? And how much of the explanation belongs to canon rather than repetition? This is where the history becomes treacherous, because later lore, fan summaries, and scattered references have encouraged a very clean answer. The cats were altered differently, their mutations damaged them, and therefore they became violent. The books do not give us anything so convenient. Sapkowski establishes that witchers survive brutal alchemical transformation, that the trial of the grasses kills many candidates, and that those who live emerge physiologically changed. But he never provides a medical doctrine stating that cat school witchers are biologically destined for madness. Brain is violent, certainly, yet Geralt does not speak to him as though his crimes were merely symptoms of an incurable mutation. He speaks to him as one responsible man speaking to another. The difference matters because Witcher mutation is already severe enough without turning it into a universal excuse. In Blood of Elves, Ciri trains at Kaer Morhen but is never subjected to the trial of the grasses, and Triss Merigold is horrified when she realizes how far the Witchers have been pushing the girl physically, even without transforming her. The old process involved mutagens, elixirs, fever, pain, and a survival rate so poor that most boys never reached adulthood. Those who endured it gained heightened reflexes, altered eyes, stronger resistance to toxins, and bodies capable of using potions that would kill ordinary people. The process was designed to create men able to survive monsters left on the continent after the conjunction of the spheres. It was not designed to make those men emotionally whole. That last distinction is easy to overlook. Witchers are often accused in the books of lacking feelings, and Geralt sometimes allows the lie to stand because it protects him from people who would rather deal with a mutant than a complicated man. Yet his attachment to Yennefer, his bond with Ciri, his loyalty to Dandelion, and even his grief prove the claim false again and again. The mutations do not remove emotion. At most, they create bodies and social identities that encourage outsiders to pretend emotion is absent. Brehin's anger, therefore, cannot be dismissed as some mechanical failure of alchemy. If anything, his resentment proves that feeling survives mutation all too well. The same is true of Geralt's violence. In The Lesser Evil, he kills Renfri's men at Blaviken because he realizes they intend to force Stregobor from his tower by threatening the townspeople. The market becomes a killing ground, and Geralt's speed makes the violence appear almost inhuman to those watching. Yet the scene is not evidence that mutation has erased his judgment. It is evidence that his judgment remains active under pressure, even when every available choice is ugly. Geralt acts because he believes people are about to die if he does nothing. Brehin's history at Iello sits beside that example like a dark mirror, not because both men kill, but because motive and restraint remain the difference between them. That is why the biological explanation for the cats can become dangerous even when it sounds plausible. If you decide that their violence was programmed into them by failed mutations, then every murder becomes inevitable and every cat becomes guilty before acting. The school ceases to be a collection of individuals and becomes a defective breed. Sapkowski's moral world almost never works that way. Monsters can possess dignity, humans can behave monstrously, and witchers can stand somewhere between without being freed from responsibility. There's another reason the mutation story is so seductive. It turns history into a technical failure rather than a social one. A bad formula is easy to blame. A society that creates professional killers despises them, underpays them, isolates them, and then acts surprised when some of them sell their blades to human employers is far more uncomfortable to examine. Witchers do not own land, inherit noble titles, command armies, or belong naturally to guilds and cities. Their trade depends on danger remaining profitable enough to justify their existence. By Geralt's era, even that trade is shrinking. Many of the great monster populations have been reduced, roads are more heavily traveled, kingdoms are better organized, and the profession itself is already passing into decline. Kaer Morhen is nearly empty compared with what it once was. While Vesemir represents a generation
that remembers more than the younger Witchers ever knew firsthand. Geralt repeatedly encounters peasants who bargain down contract prices or try to avoid paying altogether after the work is done. A Witcher may risk his life against a creature capable of tearing a man open and then discover that the village has suddenly forgotten the agreed reward. In that economy, the line between monster hunting and mercenary work becomes more than a moral abstraction. What happens when a man trained from childhood to kill realizes that another man will pay more reliably than a village threatened by drowners? The skill set transfers with terrifying ease. A Witcher knows how to read terrain, move quietly, judge distance, fight multiple opponents, use alchemical advantages, and strike before ordinary soldiers can react. Ard can break balance or throw a man from his feet. Axii can cloud judgment. Quen can turn a lethal blow aside. Igni can transform proximity into panic. And Irden can control space even though its greatest value lies against supernatural threats. Steel is already part of the Witcher's life because not every danger carries claws or spectral flesh. Nothing in the training physically prevents the sword from being turned toward a human contract. And here, the old distinction between silver and steel takes on an almost ceremonial weight. In the books, Geralt's weapons are chosen according to what he faces, and the popular simplification that silver is only for monsters and steel, only for humans, is never perfectly absolute. Certain supernatural creatures can be harmed by ordinary weapons, and practical necessity matters more than slogans. Still, the symbolism is powerful because Witchers are remembered as men carrying tools for two different categories of danger. The dark turn begins when the category that pays the contract stops mattering. A cat who accepts assassination work has not suddenly gained a new ability. He is using old abilities in a new economy. That is what makes the shift more disturbing than any invented tale of cursed mutations. Nothing supernatural needs to go wrong. The hands were already steady, the reflexes already sharpened, the body already hardened against fear and poison. Only the target changes. This is also where prejudice and practical survival begin feeding one another. If rulers and towns already consider cats unreliable, then respectable monster contracts become harder to obtain, while employers seeking intimidation or murder may prefer precisely the reputation others fear. A notorious medallion becomes useful in a different market. The same name that closes the door of a village elder can open the door of a noble who wants someone removed quietly. Once that happens, reputation stops being merely something the cats suffer from and becomes something certain cats can exploit. But exploiting a reputation changes the man carrying it. A Witcher who learns that fear produces coin begins to depend on fear, and dependence has a way of becoming habit. Contracts against humans also remove the old professional discipline of studying a monster before striking, because a human target rarely requires months of folklore, tracks, curse breaking, or knowledge of mating habits and feeding cycles. Killing becomes simpler in method, even if it becomes heavier in consequence. The craft loses part of what once restrained it. This is the point where the cat school's history moves beyond Bran's personal bitterness. The danger was never that every cat secretly wanted to murder people, nor that one mutation formula mechanically created assassins. The danger was that the Witcher profession had already produced men uniquely capable of violence, then placed some of them in conditions where violence against humans could become profitable, expected,
and eventually ordinary. Once that door opened, the cat name no longer had to be false to become a trap. And the next man we meet in the game continuity will prove why that distinction matters, because one cat was remembered not as a butcher at all, but as someone Lambert of Kaer Morhen was willing to avenge. What kind of cat earns the loyalty of Lambert? A witcher who rarely gives trust easily and almost never gives grief without anger attached to it. In the games, that question leads to Aiden, one of the most important figures in the cat school, precisely because he does not fit the reputation built around his medallion. Lambert speaks of him not as a cautionary tale, not as a dangerous mutant who eventually lost control, but as a friend. That alone complicates everything the cat name has seemed to mean so far. Lambert has spent his life among wolves, trained at Kaer Morhen, endured the same hard road as Geralt and Eskel, and developed a temperament sharp enough to keep most people at a distance. For Aiden to matter to him, the bond had to survive more than professional courtesy. In The Witcher 3, the story emerges during the quest, following the thread, where Lambert is hunting the people responsible for Aiden's death. The trail begins not in some ruined cat stronghold, but in the ordinary world of contracts, politics, and paid violence that has always surrounded Witcher work. Aiden had taken a contract involving the cursed son of a duke, an assignment that should have belonged squarely within the traditional profession. The curse was not merely a beast to be cut down in the woods, it was tied to human interests, noble households, and people with reasons to prefer one outcome over another. That is where the job becomes dangerous, in a very different way. A witcher can understand a monster and still be defeated by the people who hired him. Lambert believes that Aiden was cheated and then killed because the men involved knew exactly how vulnerable a cat witcher could be once an accusation was made. The company connected to Jad Carradine becomes the focus of his vengeance, and Lambert pursues them with a kind of persistence usually reserved for deeply personal injury. There is no suggestion that Aiden died because he lost control and massacred civilians. Instead, he appears as a professional caught in the consequences of someone else's decision. The contrast is deliberate and valuable. After Bran, the game continuity gives us a cat whose defining story is not about becoming a killer, but about being killed. That changes the shape of the question. If cat witchers were all unstable butchers, then Aiden should be easy to dismiss. Yet Lambert's memory makes that impossible. Lambert is not sentimental enough to romanticize men merely because they share his profession. He spends much of The Witcher 3 mocking idealism, resenting the life forced upon him, and refusing to pretend that witchers are noble knights. When he speaks of Aiden, the grief comes through despite that armor. His anger is evidence of affection, precisely because Lambert has so little patience for performances of it. There is also a bitter symmetry between Aiden and the reputation of the cats. Brain's name is darkened by what he did, while Aiden's name appears to have been darkened by what people expected him to do. A cat could enter a negotiation already carrying stories about yellow, assassinations, instability, and men who took contracts on humans. That made him easier to distrust and, in the wrong circumstances, easier to betray. Once violence surrounded the job, observers did not need to ask very many questions before deciding who the dangerous man must have been. A reputation can condemn the guilty, but it can also provide cover for those who harm the innocent. The The curse involving the Duke's son makes that danger particularly revealing. Witcher contracts often demand investigation before force because curses are rarely solved by swinging harder. Geralt's own career is full of cases where the human story behind a monster matters as much as the creature itself. From the Striga of Vizima to cursed individuals whose transformations cannot be understood without examining betrayal, hatred, or magic. Aidan was operating in that same profession. He was not hired as an assassin in the story Lambert tells. He was hired to deal with a curse. Yet the men around the contract turn the situation into something closer to an ambush. This is where the cat name begins to fracture under its own legend. A school can develop a genuine pattern of violence without every member sharing the guilt of that pattern. That sounds simple when stated plainly, but the world of The Witcher is built to show how rarely people behave according to simple distinctions. Peasants do not carry ledgers separating Brienne's crimes from Aidan's choices. Nobles do not always care whether a Witcher was dangerous before they decided to use him. And once fear becomes collective, an individual's conduct can matter less than the emblem around his neck. Lambert's response to Aidan's death proves that Witchers themselves can resist that collective judgment. He does not say that Aidan was one of the good cats, as though goodness were an exception requiring a category of its own. He remembers him as a man he trusted. The medallion matters to the politics around his death, but not to the friendship itself. This is one of the quietest ways the game undermines the stereotype. Personal knowledge is stronger than inherited reputation when someone has actually shared the road with the man being judged. The search for Aidan's killers also leads Geralt into a familiar moral problem. Lambert wants vengeance, and he has little interest in allowing time, distance, or claimed repentance to soften what happened. Geralt helps trace the surviving members of Caridin's old company, moving through people whose lives have changed since the murder. Some are still dangerous. Others have tried to bury their past beneath new identities and quieter routines. The trail begins with Aidan, but it soon stops being only about Aidan. That transition matters because vengeance has its own way of flattening complexity. Lambert starts from a position that is emotionally clear. His friend was killed, and the men responsible should pay. The further Geralt follows the thread, the more complicated the present becomes. Years separate the murder from the hunt, and some of those involved no longer live as they once did. The cat at the center of the story is dead, but the ethical weight shifts onto the living. Aidan's absence becomes the silence everyone else interprets according to what they want justice to mean. Here is the irony the cat school could never escape. Its worst members made suspicion rational, while its better members suffered because suspicion had become automatic. That is how a violent reputation survives even when reality underneath it is uneven. Every Brehon strengthens the legend. Every Aidan disappears inside it. The world remembers spectacular bloodshed far more easily than an ordinary contract completed without incident. Aidan, therefore, forces a new question into the history. What if the cats did not become isolated only because some of them were dangerous, but also because isolation made it harder for anyone outside their circle to know which ones were not? A Witcher traveling alone leaves behind little evidence beyond the contract, the coin, and whatever stories the village chooses to repeat. If he behaves well, the road closes behind him and life continues. If he kills, the story can travel for years. That imbalance gives fear enormous power. 100 uneventful monster hunts do not become legends, but one massacre can stain generations. Aiden's friendship with Lambert survives because Lambert knew the man himself. Beyond the medallion and beyond the rumors, the rest of the continent did not have that privilege. And when Geralt and Lambert finally reach the man they believe stands at the center of Aiden's death, the problem becomes even harder because Jad Carradine is no longer living like the killer Lambert remembers. What happens when the man at the end of a revenge trail no longer resembles the murderer you came to find? In the games, that is the problem Geralt and Lambert face when they finally reach Jad Carradine. The name belongs to a former cat witcher connected to the killing of Aiden, but by the time Geralt finds him in Novigrad, Carradine is living under another identity. He calls himself Roland Trugger, presents himself as a merchant, and has built a domestic life far removed from the roads where witchers usually die. There is a wife in his household and 2 adopted children who know him not as a contract killer, but as the man who provides for them. The contrast is deliberate enough to make vengeance suddenly uncomfortable. Carradine does not greet Lambert as a man eager to return to old violence. He claims that he abandoned his former life, left killing behind, and tried to become someone else. Whether every word he says is true is another matter, and The Witcher 3 wisely refuses to make the answer perfectly clean. Lambert sees the same man who helped destroy Aiden and wants justice measured in blood. Geralt sees a present that does not fit neatly over the past. The player is left between those 2 versions of the same person. This is one of the places where the cat story becomes more complicated than a record of atrocities. Carradine had clearly operated in criminal company, and his name is tied to a violent past that cannot be erased by respectable clothes and a quiet house. Yet the question is no longer whether he was dangerous. The question is whether a dangerous man can genuinely stop being one. A sword laid down does not unkill anyone, but neither does an old murder automatically prove that every later act is false. Lambert has little patience for that distinction because Aiden cannot benefit from Carradine's reform. Whatever life Carradine built afterward, Aiden remained dead. That makes forgiveness feel less like mercy and more like theft from the victim, especially to the man who survived him. Lambert's anger carries the logic of unfinished loyalty. If Carradine is allowed to grow old in peace, then the final consequence of Aiden's death falls only on the dead. Geralt's position is harder to pin down because his own life has repeatedly forced him to judge people whose past and present do not match.
He has seen cursed monsters restored to human form, criminals behave with unexpected tenderness, and respectable men reveal cruelty once circumstances expose them. He knows better than most that identity is not fixed by the worst thing a person has done. At the same time, he also knows that redemption claimed too loudly can become another form of self-protection. Carradine's family therefore becomes evidence of change, but not proof of innocence. There is a quiet structural irony here. Earlier, the cat reputation condemned men before their choices could be known. Now Carradine asks Geralt to judge him by his current life instead of his former one. The same problem has simply reversed direction. Reputation once made guilt too easy to assume. Respectability now risks making guilt too easy to forget.
That reversal is important because it strips the medallion of any magical moral certainty. Caridin was a cat when he lived violently, but the school itself does not explain what he does next. No mutation forces him to adopt children. No reputation requires him to build a household. If his transformation is sincere, then the man who once participated in bloodshed has made choices against the pattern expected of him. And if it is not sincere, then the domestic life becomes something colder. A murderer can learn to perform gentleness just as easily as he once learned to perform violence. Novigrad is full of masks worn for profit, survival, faith, and status. Merchants hide criminal alliances, priests hide cruelty, nobles hide fear behind titles. Caridin's new identity fits perfectly into a city where appearances are often another kind of armor. This is why Geralt's presence matters more than Lambert's certainty. Lambert has earned his rage, but rage narrows the field of vision. Geralt is forced to look at the children in the house, the years that have passed, the man standing before him, and the corpse that is not there, because Aiden's story ended long ago. Justice becomes difficult, precisely because time has continued moving for everyone except the victim. The living have had years to change. The game allows Geralt to side with Lambert and kill Caridin, or to accept the possibility that he truly left his old life behind. Neither choice feels entirely clean. Killing him can look like loyalty to Aiden, or like revenge arriving too late and striking a different man. Sparing him can look like recognition of change, or like gullibility in the face of a practiced liar. The uncertainty is not a flaw in the scene, it is the point. Here the cat school's dark history deepens in a new direction. A reputation can trap a man into the past just as surely as it can condemn him in the present. Brayan appears unable to escape what people think he is. Aiden dies under the weight of assumptions surrounding cats. Caridin, if he is telling the truth, has done the opposite and tried to outrun the identity he once earned. But there is a cost to every attempt at reinvention. A man can change his name, his trade, his clothes, and even the people who know him, but he cannot make the dead forget. Lambert carries Aiden into the room with him, and that memory has more weight than any respectable facade Caridin has built. The past in The Witcher is rarely buried cleanly. It waits in old contracts, scars, medallions, and men who remember. So when Geralt stands in Caridin's home, the cat symbol has become something stranger than a mark of danger. It has become a question about whether guilt has an ending. Not whether the crime disappears, because it does not, but whether a human life can contain both the man who killed and the man who later refused to. And before that question can settle, another cat story in the game continuity takes us somewhere even darker, because Mad Kion will show what happens when the violence associated with a Witcher is not born inside him at all, but forced into him by someone else. What if the most terrifying cat you encounter is not a murderer who chose violence, but a man whose mind was broken until violence was almost all that remained? In the games, the story of Kion answers that question with unusual cruelty. Geralt finds the trail while searching for diagrams connected to cat school equipment, following notes, corpses, and abandoned places rather than a living witness who can explain what happened. Kion had been a Witcher of the cat school, but his fate did not begin with a massacre like Yellow or a vendetta like Caridin's. It began with capture. By the time Geralt finally reaches him beneath Temple Isle in Novigrad, the Witcher he finds is less a criminal than the surviving ruin of an experiment. The man responsible is the mage Irenaeus var Steingard, whose notes reveal a fascination with Witcher physiology severe enough to become torture. Kian was restrained, studied, and subjected to repeated magical and physical experiments designed to test the limits of his altered body. A Witcher is already the product of one invasive transformation created through alchemy and pain before he is old enough to understand what is being done to him. Steingard then imposes a second violation on that body, not to create a monster hunter, but to satisfy curiosity. The symmetry is grim. Kian survives one institution's experiments only to be destroyed by another man's. The records Geralt finds make the cruelty clinical rather than theatrical. Steingard observes the Witcher's resistance, reactions, and mental deterioration as though he were examining an unusual specimen rather than a conscious person. That language matters because prejudice often begins by turning someone into a category before turning him into a target. Kian is no longer a man with a name, contracts, memories, and habits. He is useful because he is a Witcher. His mutations, the same changes that once helped him survive monsters, now make him valuable to someone who wants to discover how much suffering such a body can endure. There is no grand political motive behind the experiments. No kingdom is saved by them. No curse is lifted, and no army depends on the result. And the horror lies precisely in their unnecessary nature. Steingard does not destroy Kian because he must. He destroys him because he can. When Geralt eventually finds Kian, the encounter offers no clean rescue. The Cat Witcher attacks, his mind shattered beyond any ordinary conversation or recognition, and Geralt has to fight him. The violence at the end is real, but its origin lies elsewhere. Kian has become dangerous, yet the danger is the result of prolonged abuse rather than evidence that the cat medallion concealed some inevitable madness from the beginning. The game places the player in front of the outcome after carefully revealing the cause. That order is important because the same scene would mean something entirely different without Steingard's notes. A stranger entering the chamber and seeing only Kian would find everything. The old stereotype seems to promise a deranged cat witcher lunging from the darkness with murderous intent. The reputation would appear confirmed in an instant. Geralt, however, knows what happened before the sword leaves its sheath. Knowledge changes the moral shape of the fight, even when it cannot change the necessity of surviving it. There is a historical cruelty in this pattern. Witchers are feared because their bodies have been altered beyond ordinary human limits, and those same altered bodies make them objects of fascination for mages, rulers, and anyone who sees utility where a person should be. Geralt spends much of the books dealing with people who want to use what Witchers are while despising them for being it. Kian's fate is an extreme version of that relationship. He is valuable enough to study and disposable enough to torture. The cat reputation makes the situation worse because it supplies an explanation after the fact. If Kian emerges violent and incoherent, a world already suspicious of cats has no need to ask what was done to him. Madness fits the story people expect. The torture disappears behind the behavior it created. That is one of the most dangerous things a reputation can do. It can conceal causation. Notice how different this is from Brehon. Brehon's crimes force us to preserve responsibility, even while acknowledging isolation and bitterness. Kian forces the opposite discipline. Here, responsibility must not be invented simply because the final behavior looks familiar. The two cats stand at opposite ends of the same problem, and confusing them would make the history easier, but less truthful. The distinction also matters for Geralt's own judgment. Witchers are trained to identify causes because monster hunting demands it.
A wraith may be bound to an injustice. A curse may have conditions. A transformation may hide a human history beneath claws and hunger. Killing without understanding can mean treating the symptom while leaving the real danger untouched. Kian's chamber asks Geralt to apply that same professional instinct to another Witcher. There is no sign capable of restoring what Steingard took from him. Axii can influence a mind, but it cannot simply rebuild years of shattered identity. Quen can block a blow, but not the experiments already endured. Swallow can help a wounded Witcher survive, yet survival itself is exactly what condemned Kian to continue suffering. The tools of the trade are suddenly powerless against the deeper injury. That helplessness gives the encounter its particular sadness. Witchers are accustomed to contracts with solutions. Identify the creature, prepare the oil, choose the blade, learn the curse, survive the night. Kian offers no such sequence. The monster has already been made, the maker is absent, and the surviving victim is too broken to return to the path. Geralt can only end what someone else began, and that leaves a question hanging over every later cat we meet. If one Witcher becomes violent through choice and another through torment, how much can the medallion really tell us before we know the story attached to it? The answer will become harder at Honorton, because Gaetan's case gives Geralt something Kian's never did. A cat who can explain exactly why the killing started, and a village full of bodies proving that whatever the reason was, it did not stop in time. Why does Gaetan's story feel harder to judge than Brienne's, even though the bodies at Honorton leave less room for denial? In the games, Geralt reaches that ruined Velen village during the quest, where the cat and wolf play, and the scene is built to resist a simple verdict from the start. There are corpses in houses and yards, blood where ordinary village life should have continued, and one surviving child named Millie hiding among the dead. Geralt investigates tracks, wounds, and signs of what happened before finding another Witcher. The medallion around that man's neck bears the cat. By then, the village itself has already become testimony. Gaetan does not deny the killing. He explains that he had accepted a contract to deal with Elation, a dangerous forest spirit whose presence can dominate woods and terrify settlements for years. After completing the job, he says, the villagers refused to pay the agreed sum and then tried to murder him instead. That part of the story matters because Witchers are frequently cheated after surviving the very danger others hired them to face. Geralt himself knows how quickly gratitude can vanish once the monster is dead and the purse has to be opened. A contract dispute turning violent is entirely believable in the world of The Witcher. If the story ended with Gaetan killing the men who attacked him, the moral line would be difficult, but recognizable. A Witcher surrounded by armed villagers after a completed contract would have only moments to react, and his reflexes are designed precisely for surviving such moments. Self-defense does not become murder simply because the survivor is better at fighting than the attackers. Geralt understands that instinctively
because he has lived through ambushes of his own. The problem is that Honorton did not end with the men who drew weapons. The killing spread. Gaetan admits that once the bloodshed began, he continued through the settlement. People who had not attacked him died as well. Homes became extensions of the fight, and the distinction between aggressor and bystander disappeared beneath anger. This is the point where his explanation stops functioning as a defense and starts becoming evidence. He had a reason to fight back. He did not have a reason to kill everyone. Millie's survival gives the massacre its most painful detail. Gaetan spared her, and that single act proves he was still capable of recognizing innocence in the middle of what he was doing. He was not an automaton lost entirely to mutation, nor a mindless creature striking anything that moved. Somewhere inside the violence, judgment remained. That makes the deaths of the others harder, not easier, because restraint existed and was used only once. Geralt's investigation before meeting Gaetan is important for the same reason. He does not arrive, see a cat medallion, and decide the case from reputation. He reconstructs what happened from physical evidence. That is the Witcher's method applied not to a monster contract, but to another Witcher. Tracks, wounds, bodies, and testimony matter more than rumor. The scene quietly insists that even the darkest cat must be judged by facts rather than by the school's name. There is a harsh symmetry between Gaetan and the villagers who betrayed him. They appear to have decided that a Witcher could be cheated because he was isolated and dangerous, while Gaetan decided that a village could be punished because some of its people tried to kill him. Each side turns individuals into a category. To the villagers, the Witcher becomes disposable. To Gaetan, the village becomes guilty. That is where the cat school's reputation stops being merely something imposed from outside and becomes something one of its members actively confirms. Earlier, Aiden showed how a cat could suffer beneath prejudice. Keon showed how a cat could be made violent through torture. Gaetan shows the more difficult possibility. A man can be genuinely wronged and still become responsible for something worse than the wrong done to him. Victimhood and guilt are not mutually exclusive. Geralt's eventual choice reflects that complexity. In the game, the player can have him fight Gaetan or let him go. Sparing him does not require believing the massacre was acceptable. Killing him does not require believing the villagers were innocent in the events that began the confrontation. The choice asks whether understanding the road to an atrocity changes what should happen after it. Gaetan himself complicates the judgment further by suggesting that Honorton was not the first time a contract had ended in lethal betrayal. His scars and bitterness imply a pattern of accumulated resentment, though the game does not give every previous incident the same detailed reconstruction. That history matters psychologically, but it does not transfer guilt from one village to another. Repeated betrayal can make rage comprehensible. It cannot make strangers responsible for old wounds they did not inflict. This is the point where the thesis has to change shape. At the beginning, the question was whether the cats became killers because the world had already decided they were. Honorton shows that the answer cannot remain entirely sympathetic. A reputation may pressure a man toward violence, but there comes a moment when he adds new blood to the reputation with his own hands. Once that happens, the feedback loop is no longer only imposed from outside, and yet Geralt cannot judge Gaetan from some clean moral height. He carries his own title, the Butcher of Blaviken,
a name born from a marketplace filled with corpses and people who did not understand the threat he believed he was stopping. The resemblance is uncomfortable enough that the game deliberately places it between them. Both men can point to circumstances, danger, and decisions made in seconds. The difference lies in where the killing ended. That difference will matter in the next part because Geralt's own history now becomes the measure against which Gaetan has to be read. The question is no longer whether Witchers kill humans. That has been settled long ago. The question is whether there remains a boundary inside violence itself, and whether a man who has crossed it can still recognize where it was. Why is Geralt the right man to judge Gaetan when his own name has also been tied to a massacre? The answer begins in Blaviken, in Sapkowski's short story, The Lesser Evil, long before the events of The Witcher 3. Geralt enters the town already caught between Stregobor, a mage convinced that Renfri is a monster shaped by the curse of the Black Sun, and Renfri herself, a woman whose life has been brutalized by the fear surrounding that prophecy. He tries to remain neutral because every path seems corrupted. Then he realizes that Renfri's men are preparing to threaten the townspeople in order to draw Stregobor from his tower. By the time Geralt moves, the choice is narrowed to killing armed men in the marketplace or allowing civilians to become leverage. The violence is fast because Geralt is faster. His training, mutations, and swordsmanship make the encounter brutally efficient. And to the people of Blaviken, the result is simpler than the reasoning that produced it. They see bodies. They see a Witcher standing over them. The name that follows is the Butcher of Blaviken. That title is important because it shows how badly public memory handles context. Geralt acts to prevent what he believes will become a greater slaughter. Yet the people who later repeat the story do not carry his calculation with them. A nickname survives more easily than a moral dilemma. Renfri's threats, Stregobor's cowardice, and Geralt's reluctance are compressed into one image of a mutant killing men in a market. He becomes an example of exactly the mechanism that later distorts the cat school. But similarity of reputation does not mean similarity of action. This is the point the Gaetan story tests with unusual precision. Geralt kills Renfri's armed companions because he believes they are about to turn civilians into hostages and victims. Gaetan kills the men who attack him, then continues into a village where people who did not take part in the ambush also die. In both cases, there is blood, a Witcher, and a public story that can be simplified. The moral difference lies in whom the sword reaches after the immediate threat is gone. That distinction is easy to blur if you focus only on body counts. Geralt's ethics are rarely clean, but they are usually structured around containment. Stop the threat, break the curse, prevent the worst outcome, and then stop. Even when he hates the choice, he looks for a boundary. Gaetan's massacre at Honorton reveals what happens when rage consumes that boundary. Once retaliation expands to include the uninvolved, violence stops being a response and becomes punishment. Here is the uncomfortable part. Geralt knows that shift can happen quickly. Witchers do not fight slowly enough for moral philosophy to unfold between blows. A wrong movement, a flash of fear, or one more attacker entering a doorway can turn a controlled fight into something far larger in seconds. Geralt has survived enough ambushes to understand how thin the practical line can be. That is why he can comprehend Gaetan without excusing him.
recognition is not absolution. The game makes this tension explicit if Geralt chooses to spare Gaetan. He can acknowledge that he, too, has been called a butcher, and that circumstances are not always visible to outsiders. That response does not erase Honorton. It frames the decision through Geralt's own history of being judged by aftermath rather than intent. If Geralt chooses to kill Gaetan instead, the logic is equally rooted in his experience. A witcher who keeps crossing the line becomes too dangerous to leave on the path. This is where the wolf and cat comparison becomes most useful. The difference between them is not that wolves kill only monsters while cats kill men, because the books make that impossible to defend. Geralt kills humans throughout his life, and so do other witchers when circumstances force it. The real distinction is whether violence remains governed by purpose. Once killing becomes its own answer, the profession has lost the discipline that makes it something more than hired brutality. That discipline begins long before any duel. Witcher work is built around investigation, preparation, and restraint, because monsters are not interchangeable targets. A Striga may be cursed and curable. A Noon Wraith can be bound to unfinished trauma. A werewolf may still be a man whose condition can sometimes be understood rather than simply destroyed. Geralt's best work often depends on asking what he is facing before deciding whether it deserves death. That same method applies to people. Renfri is not a simple villain, and Stregobor is not a simple victim. Gaetan is not a mindless murderer, and the villagers of Honorton are not entirely innocent because some of them betrayed and attacked him. The difficulty comes from refusing to flatten any of them into one role. Geralt's moral advantage, when he has one, is that he keeps asking questions after the easy categories have failed. There is also a practical reason this matters to the reputation of witchers. Every massacre committed by one of them strengthens the fear already surrounding the profession. Peasants do not distinguish between schools with the precision of collectors comparing medallions. A cat who kills a village makes the next wolf, griffin, or bear who arrives for a contract more suspect as well. One man's loss of control becomes another man's closed door. The cats suffer most from that cycle because their name has already accumulated stories of instability and human bloodshed. Gaetan does not create the stereotype by himself, but Honorton gives it another piece of evidence that will travel farther than the reasons behind it. Future villagers will hear about the cat who butchered a settlement, not about the Leshen contract, the withheld payment, the ambush, or the child he spared. The legend becomes cleaner as it moves away from the scene. Reality becomes less so. And this is why Geralt's judgment can never be reduced to whether he sympathizes with another witcher. He has to decide what kind of violence the profession can survive morally, not just physically. If every betrayal justifies collective punishment, then a witcher becomes indistinguishable from the monsters people hire him to remove. If every act of violence is condemned without context, then Blaviken itself becomes proof against Geralt. The line has to exist somewhere between those two failures. Gaetan forces that line into view because his story contains both injustice and atrocity. The villagers who attacked him were wrong. The people he killed afterward did not become guilty merely by sharing their roofs, their fields, or their name with the attackers. Geralt understands both statements at once, and that is what makes his judgment meaningful. The next turn in the story will take us away from Honorton and back to the saga, where one of the most dangerous human killers in the books carries a cat medallion as a trophy and makes the symbol mean something stranger still. Why does one of the most important cat medallions in the book spend so much of the saga around the neck of a man who was never a witcher at all? Leo Bonhart answers that question with a kind of violence that makes even the darkest cat stories look different. In the Tower of the Swallow, he enters Ciri's path as a professional killer of terrifying confidence, a man whose reputation rests not on mutation or signs, but on experience, speed, and the willingness to kill without hesitation. Among his trophies are Witcher medallions bearing the wolf, cat, and griffin. Bonhart claims that he killed the Witchers who once wore them. Sapkowski never pauses to give those dead men names, which leaves the cat among them as a silent absence rather than a fully told life. That silence matters because Bonhart's trophies reverse the usual hierarchy of fear. Witchers are supposed to be the enhanced killers. Ordinary men avoid provoking, yet here is an ordinary human who displays their medallions like proof that even they can be hunted. He has no altered eyes, no trial of the grasses behind him, and no witcher potions flowing through his veins. His danger comes from skill, cruelty, and discipline sharpened into something almost predatory. The existence of the medallions makes his claims difficult to dismiss entirely, even if the books preserve some ambiguity around exactly how each trophy was obtained. What matters most is that Bonhart wants people to believe he kills Witchers, and he possesses enough evidence to make that belief terrifyingly plausible. The cat medallion therefore enters this part of the saga stripped of institutional meaning. It no longer tells us about a school, a fortress, a mutation process, or a contract. It tells us that someone died. The unknown Witcher who once carried it has been reduced to metal in another man's collection. That is a brutal fate for an emblem already burdened by stories of murder, because the supposed killer has become the trophy of a greater killer. The symbol survives while the man disappears. Bonhart's treatment of Ciri makes that reversal even darker. By the time he reaches her, she has been riding with the rats and living under the name Falca, moving through one of the most dangerous phases of her life. The rats are young outlaws who rob, kill, and dress their violence in bravado, and Ciri has begun to absorb their habits while carrying wounds of her own that no one around her knows how to heal. Bonhart does not rescue her from that life. He destroys it with deliberate cruelty. When Bonhart massacres the rats, he does not simply win a fight. He makes Ciri watch the destruction of the people who had become, however imperfectly, her chosen companions. Their deaths sever the identity she had built as Falca and leave her exposed to someone far more disciplined than the band she had been riding with. Bonhart then captures her and treats humiliation as a method of control. The violence is calculated, not chaotic. That distinction is important when placed beside Gaetan. Gaetan's massacre begins in betrayal and escalates through rage. Bonhart needs no such trigger. He kills because killing is his profession, his advantage, and in many moments clearly a source of domination. There is no school reputation shaping him and no mutation to blame. Sapkowski places one of the saga's most frightening human killers outside the Witcher system entirely. Bonhart's association with the arena under Huvenagel sharpens that point. In the Tower of the Swallow, Ciri is forced into combat for the entertainment and profit of others, her survival turned into spectacle. Bonhart helps place her inside that machinery. She is valuable to him because she can fight, endure, and attract attention. The cruelty is almost institutional in its efficiency. The arena also mirrors the Witcher problem in a distorted way. Witchers are trained to turn violence into a profession because monsters exist and people need protection. Ciri is forced to turn violence into performance because others are willing to pay to watch. The skill may look similar from the outside, but the purpose has been inverted. Survival remains real, yet meaning has been stripped away. This is where the cat medallion begins to detach itself from the cat school's reputation and become something broader. Bonhart wears it without belonging to the cats. Ciri sees it while being subjected to violence by a human who has no Witcher mutation at all. The medallion can no longer function as evidence that cats are uniquely monstrous because the man carrying it commits horrors without sharing anything of their origin. The symbol has become a witness rather than a verdict. That is one reason Bonhart matters so much to the larger argument. If the darkest violence in this story belonged only to mutated witchers, then the cat school could still be treated as a failed experiment in human engineering. Bonhart destroys that comfort. He proves that the capacity for calculated cruelty does not require alchemy, medallions, or the path. An ordinary man can become more frightening than many of the creatures witchers are trained to hunt. His death at Stiga Castle completes the reversal. In The Lady of the Lake, Ciri finally faces Bonhart in the chaos surrounding Vilgefortz's stronghold. By then, she is no longer the captive girl he humiliated in the arena, even though the memory of that captivity remains inside every movement. Their duel is a collision between everything Bonhart tried to reduce her to and everything she has survived beyond him. When she kills him, the trophies he carried cease to belong to the hunter. Afterward, Ciri takes the cat medallion. Geralt receives the wolf medallion, while the cat remains with the girl who was trained at Kaer Morhen but never underwent the trial of the grasses. That choice is one of the most suggestive details Sapkowski leaves behind. Ciri is not a cat witcher in institutional terms. She is not even a mutated witcher at all, and yet the symbol fits her story in a way no formal lineage could have predicted. She has lived among wolves, learned swordsmanship under witchers, studied magic with Yennefer, carried the elder blood, ridden with criminals, crossed worlds, survived Bonhart, and repeatedly been forced into identities chosen for her by others. The cat medallion therefore reaches her after passing through an unknown dead witcher and then through the hands of a human killer. Its history is already fractured before she claims it. That fracture makes it strangely appropriate. So the question now changes again. The medallion began as evidence of a feared tradition, then became a trophy of murder, and now rests with someone who does not belong neatly to any school at all. If a symbol can survive that many transformations, perhaps it was never capable of defining the person who wore it in the first place. Ciri's next step will make that possibility impossible to ignore, because she takes the cat not as proof of what she was made to be, but after spending much of her life fighting against identities imposed from outside. Why does Ciri choose the cat medallion when almost every formative part of her Witcher training came from the wolves? In the books, she arrives at Kaer Morhen as Geralt's child of surprise, the daughter of Pavetta and Duny, and the granddaughter of Queen Calanthe of Cintra. Vesemir, Lambert, Eskel, Cohen, and Geralt train her in balance, movement, endurance, and swordplay. But they never put her through the trial of the grasses. She learns the physical discipline of witchers without becoming one through mutation. That distinction follows her for the rest of the saga. Ciri is shaped by the path without ever fitting the profession's traditional definition. Her education then widens beyond Kaer Morhen. Triss Merigold recognizes that Ciri's strange experiences cannot be explained by witcher training alone, and Yennefer later becomes her teacher in magic, discipline, and control. Ciri carries the elder blood of Lara Dorren, and that inheritance connects her to powers over time and space that no witcher mutation could produce. By the time she leaves the shelter of the wolves, she is already becoming something the old schools have no category for. She can wield a sword like a witcher, learn magic like a sorceress, and carry a bloodline that draws the ambitions of kings, mages, and the wild hunt. The cat medallion will eventually suit her precisely because no single institution can contain her. That does not mean her path toward it is noble from beginning to end. After the catastrophe around Thaned and her passage through the Korath Desert, Ciri falls in with the rats, the young bandits who give her shelter and a new identity. She begins calling herself Falka, taking the name of a historical rebel associated with bloodshed and revolt. Among the rats, theft and killing become part of daily survival, then gradually something closer to performance and belonging. Ciri is wounded, frightened, angry, and young enough for violence to begin feeling like control. This period matters because it places her closer to the cat's darkest reputation than Kaer Morhen ever did. She is not murdering villagers for withheld payment, and the books do not turn her into a simple villain, but she does begin to enjoy danger and the power of being feared. The rats encourage that identity because they live outside the structures that failed them. Ciri's skill with a blade makes her valuable, and the name Falka gives her a mask through which pain can become aggression. She's learning firsthand how quickly survival can harden into appetite. Here is the psychological turn that makes the cat medallion meaningful. Ciri repeatedly has identities forced upon her by other people: Princess of Cintra, political heir, source of elder blood, potential mother of a prophesied line, pawn of emperors, object of Vilgefortz's plans. Falka is one of the first identities she actively chooses, but even that choice is shaped by injury and exile. The name feels like freedom because it belongs to no court. In reality, it risks becoming another cage. Bonhart shatters that illusion with terrible efficiency. When he kills the rats, captures Ciri, and forces her into Huvanagel's arena, the swagger of Falka is exposed as something too fragile to protect her. She survives because the deeper skills beneath the persona remain. Kaer Morhen's training, instinct, endurance, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. Bonhart tries to turn her violence into property. Every fight she survives becomes proof that her body is useful to someone else. That is why the final duel at Stiga carries more weight than simple revenge. Ciri is not merely killing the man who hurt her. She is reclaiming agency from someone who reduced her to spectacle and control. Bonhart's medallions, including the cat, have functioned as trophies, proving that he could kill men who were supposed to be harder to kill than ordinary humans. When Ciri takes the cat from him, she reverses that logic. The trophy of domination becomes an object chosen by the survivor. Notice what Sapkowski does not do. He does not reveal that Ciri secretly belongs to the cat school, nor does he invent a lost cat lineage that explains her behavior. Her blood comes from Lara Dorn and the Elder bloodline, not from Witcher schools. Her sword training comes largely from the wolves at Kaer Morhen. Her magical education comes through Yennefer, while her later power over time and space exceeds anything in ordinary Witcher practice. The medallion therefore becomes symbolic rather than genealogical. Geralt receives the wolf because the wolf is the school and tradition that formed him. Ciri takes the cat because her life no longer fits the neat inheritance Geralt's does. She has survived by moving between identities, crossing borders both literal and metaphysical. The cat becomes less a badge of school membership than an emblem of a person who refuses to remain where others place her. There is an irony here that reaches back to the cats themselves. A symbol associated with unstable witchers and killers ends up around the neck of someone whose central struggle is against being defined by what others expect her to become. Prophecy expects one thing from Ciri, Emir expects another. Vilgefortz, the elves of the Ain El, and countless political factions try to reduce her to a function. Ciri survives those expectations without emerging untouched by them. She has killed, hated, fled, and made choices that leave scars. The books never sanitize her into a purely innocent figure after the rats. What changes is that she stops allowing violence to become the only identity available to her. She can carry what happened without becoming nothing but what happened. In the game continuity, The Witcher 3 preserves the cat medallion as part of Ciri's visual identity, and the choice becomes even more resonant because the game places her beside living examples of what cat witchers can become. Aiden is remembered with loyalty, Kian is destroyed by torture, Caradin claims to have changed, and Gaetan stands over the consequences of rage. Ciri's medallion visually links her to that unstable moral field without making her a member of their institution. It becomes a quiet reminder that symbols gather histories they cannot control. That is the deeper transformation of the cat emblem. Around Bonhart, it means conquest. Around Ciri, it means survival after conquest failed. Around Brehen or Gaetan, it marks men whose choices helped darken the reputation surrounding the school. The same piece of metal can carry entirely different moral weight, depending on the life beneath it. And that prepares the final complication before the story begins to close. The books leave the cat identity fragmented and suggestive, while the games expand it through individual tragedies and crimes. The Netflix adaptation then takes Brehen and deliberately reshapes his function again, giving the same name a different path in a separate continuity. The question is no longer simply what the cats were, but why every version of the story seems drawn to the same uneasy possibility that a feared killer may still retain the power to choose what kind of person he becomes next. Why does the Netflix adaptation take Brehen, one of the book's clearest examples of a dangerous cat, and give him a final act that points in almost the opposite direction? In the Netflix adaptation, Brehen appears in The Rats, a Witcher tale, a prequel special set before the rats encounter Ciri at the end of Season 3. This is not the same continuity as Sapkowski's Season of Storms, and the distinction matters immediately. The adaptation keeps the name, the cat school identity, and the sense of a witcher whose best years appear to be behind him, but it builds a substantially different story around those pieces. Netflix presents him as rough, mistrusted, and worn down, rather than simply importing the Cat of Yellow episode intact. From that point onward, the show is deliberately rewriting the function Brian serves. In the Netflix adaptation, the rats recruit Brian because they are planning a robbery connected to Dominic Huvenigel's fighting arena. Missel, Gisela, Iskra, Kaylee, Reef, and Ass are already living as young outlaws on a continent, being torn apart by war, and the special follows them before Siri becomes part of their group. Their target involves wealth being concealed by Brigden, but the obstacle guarding it is not something ordinary thieves are equipped to handle. Brigden is using a creature called a Jallowick to protect the riches they intend to steal. That gives the rats a reason to seek the one kind of professional whose entire life has been built around confronting things other people should not approach. Bran initially fits the image people expect from a cat. He is abrasive, difficult, and reluctant to become entangled with a band of reckless young criminals. The special describes him as a washed-up witcher, someone who has drifted far enough from any heroic image of the profession that the rats are hardly recruiting a shining protector. Yet his usefulness is undeniable, because whatever has happened to him emotionally, the old training remains. He understands monsters, danger, and the cost of standing too close to either. The cat's old contradiction is therefore present from the beginning. Society may distrust the Witcher, but when something unnatural waits behind a locked door, people still want his sword nearby. The relationship that changes him most visibly is his connection with Missel. In the Netflix adaptation, their interactions move between hostility and something almost paternal, with both characters recognizing damage in the other long before either would describe it openly. Missel is carrying the effects of war and personal loss, while Brahan is introduced as a man who has survived long enough to become hardened by what survival required. Their bond does not suddenly make him gentle. It gives him someone whose pain he understands without needing it explained. That is a striking alteration when placed beside Sapkowski's Brahan. In Season of Storms, the Cat of Yellow confronts Geralt from a place of resentment and exclusion, and the massacre attached to his name remains the defining shadow over him. In the Netflix adaptation, the same name becomes attached to a man whose relationship with younger outcasts slowly draws protective instincts back to the surface. The adaptation is not revealing a secret chapter omitted from the novel. It is asking a different question with a familiar character. The heist itself makes that question increasingly uncomfortable. In the Netflix adaptation, the Jallowick guarding Brigden's stolen wealth is eventually revealed to have once been Juniper, Missel's former lover. Alchemical experimentation has transformed her into the creature the rats now have to survive. The discovery places another mutilated life at the center of a Cat Witcher story, but this time Brahan is not the victim of the experiment, as Kian was in the game continuity. He is the professional standing beside someone forced to confront what experimentation has done to a person she loved. Missel ultimately has to kill Juniper to save the others. That act gives the Netflix story a grim echo of classic Witcher contracts.
where identifying the humanity inside a monster does not guarantee that the humanity can be restored. Geralt's encounter with the Striga proves that curses can sometimes be broken, but the wider Witcher world has never promised that every transformation has a cure. Here, the creature's former identity makes the necessary violence more painful rather than less necessary. Brehyn witnesses a younger survivor being forced into exactly the kind of choice Witchers spend their lives making. And notice what the adaptation is doing with him at this point. Brehyn begins the story as the experienced killer among inexperienced outlaws, the man who should be least shocked by death. Yet the younger characters gradually give him something more dangerous than another monster contract: attachment. A solitary Witcher can leave after the coin is paid. A man who has started caring about the people beside him has something he can lose. The arrival of Leo Bonhart turns that vulnerability into the final test. In the Netflix adaptation, Bonhart is connected to Huvanahel and becomes involved as the robbery collapses around the rats. He is already the ruthless bounty hunter who will eventually hunt the group and slaughter them in Season 4. Brehyn, meanwhile, carries something Bonhart wants for reasons entirely consistent with the trophy imagery inherited from the books: a Witcher medallion. Once again, the cat symbol draws the attention of a human predator. But this time, Netflix supplies an origin for one of those trophies that Sapkowski deliberately left unnamed. Bran locks himself inside the vault with Bonhart so the rats can escape. He knows what kind of man he is trapping himself with, and the choice is not presented as an accident or a failed attempt to flee. It is sacrifice. Bonhart kills him, and Bran's cat medallion becomes exactly the kind of trophy associated with the bounty hunter in the original novels. That connection must remain firmly inside the Netflix continuity. The books do not say that Bonhart's cat medallion belonged to Brehyn, and Sapkowski's Brehyn is not canonically killed in this way. The adaptation has taken an unresolved object from the saga and attached it to a named character for dramatic closure. It is an elegant bridge inside the show's own version of events, but it should never be retroactively treated as the answer to the novel's mystery. Parallel continuities become misleading only when their boundaries are erased. The difference between the two Brehyns is more revealing than any attempt to force them together. Sapkowski uses Brehyn to show how far a Witcher can fall while still retaining enough agency to be warned that another massacre will have consequences. Netflix uses him to ask whether a man with a dark reputation can find one final decision that is larger than it. One version leaves Geralt watching a dangerous cat walk away. The other leaves the rats escaping because a cat chose not to. There is a moral risk in such a rewrite because sacrifice cannot erase whatever came before it. A heroic death is not a ledger that cancels every earlier act. The Netflix adaptation avoids making Bran innocent by presenting him instead as damaged and flawed, someone trying to recover a part of himself, rather than someone revealed to have been secretly virtuous all along. That distinction keeps the redemption from becoming too clean. What changes at the end is not his past, but the direction of his final choice. And this is why the adaptation's Brehyn belongs in the larger cat story despite existing in a separate continuity. He turns the symbol one more time from feared killer to reluctant protector without pretending that either identity completely cancels the other. The cats have now appeared as murderers, victims, friends, mercenaries, broken experiments, repentant men, and symbols carried by people who never belonged to their school at all. One final question remains before we return to the silent houses of Honorton. After so many different lives beneath the same medallion, was the darkest thing about the cat school really what its witchers were? Or what everyone eventually learned to expect from the sight of the cat? What remains of the cat school once every easy explanation has failed? The books give us Brehin, the cat of Iello, violent enough that Geralt warns him another massacre will end, whatever professional restraint still protects him. The saga gives us Bonhart's cat medallion, stripped from an unknown dead witcher and carried as a trophy by a human killer, more frightening than many mutants. In the games, Aiden is remembered with loyalty. Jad Carradine claims to have abandoned murder. Kian is broken by torture. And Gaetan leaves Honorton full of bodies after a contract turns into betrayal and rage. In the Netflix adaptation, Brian follows a different path again and dies, protecting the rats. The symbol survives all of them, but it no longer supports a simple verdict. That is the final irony of the cats. Their reputation was not invented from nothing, because men like Brehin and Gaetan gave the continent real reasons to fear them. At the same time, Aiden and Kian make it impossible to treat every cat as proof of some corrupted bloodline or failed mutation. One man can be guilty, another innocent, a third broken, and a fourth attempting to change. A school name can preserve patterns without explaining every individual inside them. The mistake begins when history stops distinguishing between the pattern and the person. The continent is especially vulnerable to that mistake because witchers already live outside ordinary society. Their yellow eyes, mutations, potions, long lives, and unnatural reflexes make them useful when monsters appear, and suspect when they do not. A wolf entering a village may be insulted because he is a witcher. A cat can carry the additional burden of stories about assassinations, madness, and massacres. That extra suspicion changes negotiations before the first word about coin is spoken. It also changes what people are prepared to believe when blood is later found on the floor. Once that cycle begins, every side starts behaving according to the reputation it fears. Villagers may cheat a cat because they expect him to be dangerous and transient, someone unlikely to receive justice from a magistrate. A cat who expects betrayal may enter the same negotiation already prepared for violence. If steel is drawn, both sides feel confirmed. The next village hears only that another cat left corpses behind. This does not make the massacre inevitable. That distinction must remain intact, because without it the history becomes an excuse instead of an explanation. Gaetan was betrayed at Honorton, but the people who did not attack him were still not responsible for that betrayal. Brain may have been isolated, but isolation did not command his hand at Iello. Carradine may have suffered prejudice as a cat, but that does not erase whatever role he played in Aiden's death. The pressure around a choice can be immense while the choice remains a choice. And that is where the cat school becomes more revealing than a simple story about rogue witchers. Its history exposes how reputations become systems. At first, a name describes what certain men have done. Then employers, villagers, soldiers, and other witchers begin acting toward every bearer of that name, as though the verdict has already been passed. Eventually, some of those bearers discover that the feared identity
has practical uses. A stigma becomes a profession, and the profession produces new evidence for the stigma. There is something historically bleak about that process because the Witcher world is already dying when most of these stories reach us. Kaer Morhen is diminished, new Witchers are rarely being created, and the monsters that once justified whole schools are no longer numerous enough to support the profession in the same way. Men trained for one age survive into another that has less use for them. Some adapt by taking different contracts, others disappear. The cats seem to have adapted more brutally than most, at least in the stories that survived. That may be partly why their worst members are remembered so vividly. A Witcher who quietly kills a grave hag, accepts his coin, and rides away leaves almost no history behind. A Witcher who murders a village becomes a story told for decades. Records favor catastrophe. That imbalance matters when we ask what the cat school really was. We are reconstructing it from survivors, rumors, trophies, quest trails, dead bodies, and later expansions of lore. The quiet cats who did ordinary work are almost invisible precisely because ordinary success rarely enters legend. Aiden gives us one glimpse of that missing population, but even he becomes known to us because he was murdered. The archive itself is biased toward disaster. Ciri's cat medallion quietly resists that bias. She does not inherit it because she shares the crimes of Bran or Gaetan, and she does not wear it as proof that she belongs to some hidden cat lineage. She takes it after surviving Bonhard, after the rats, after Kaer Morhen, after Yennefer's teaching, and after being forced into more identities than most people could survive. The symbol reaches her already stripped of any single meaning. In her hands, it becomes evidence that an emblem cannot finish a person's story. That is why the cat works so well as the final symbol of this history. It belongs to a school remembered for men who crossed lines, yet it ends up associated with someone whose entire life is defined by refusing to remain inside the roles others assign her. Ciri is princess and fugitive, student and killer, child and heir, Falca and Cirilla, but none of those names alone contains her. The medallion does not absolve the cats. It simply proves that symbols are weaker than choices. And so we return at last to Honorton. The light has gone down behind the trees, the village is quiet, and the houses stand exactly where Gaetan left them. Millie survives because one man, in the middle of a massacre, still made one different decision. That detail is small, but it is enough to keep the story from becoming mechanical. Even at his worst, choice had not vanished completely. Geralt stands in that silence with all the knowledge a Witcher can gather from blood, tracks, wounds, and testimony. The cat medallion tells him something, but not enough. It tells him what school Gaetan came from, what reputation follows him, and what sort of training shaped his body. It cannot tell Geralt whether to forgive him. That judgment has to come from what happened in the village. Perhaps that is the darkest truth in the cat school's history. The cats were not terrifying because a medallion made them monsters. They were terrifying because some of them became exactly what fear had predicted, while others were destroyed by being treated as though they already had. Between those two outcomes lies the narrow space where responsibility still matters. And in the fading light over Honorton, the little metal cat catches one last glint before the road goes dark. If you stay with the cat school long enough, the question slowly changes. At first, it seems to be about why these witchers became killers, why their medallion gathered such a dark reputation, and why men like Brehan or Gaetan could cross boundaries that Geralt still tried to preserve. But beneath all of that lies something more human and more difficult. Whether a person can ever be separated from the story others have already decided to tell about him. The continent is full of people who judge by blood, race, mutation, accent, birthplace, and rumor, and witchers have always lived close to the edge of that instinct. The cats simply show what happens when prejudice meets enough real violence to make the prejudice feel justified. Once that happens, guilt and expectation begin feeding each other until no one remembers which came first. That is why the cat school fits so naturally into the moral logic of The Witcher. Sapkowski's world rarely asks you to choose between innocence and evil, as though the answer were waiting in plain sight. Geralt can save a cursed princess and still become known as the Butcher of Blaviken. Ciri can be loved as a daughter, feared as elder blood, hunted as a political prize, and still remain someone no prophecy fully owns. A witcher can be a protector in one village and a murderer in another, while a human like Leo Bonhart can carry no mutations at all and still become more monstrous than many creatures born from the conjunction. You are never allowed the comfort of believing in that monstrosity belongs to one species, one school, or one medallion. The cats make that idea especially sharp because their history keeps resisting a single explanation. Brehan cannot be excused merely because he was excluded. Aiden cannot be condemned merely because he wore the same symbol. Kian cannot be blamed for what torture made of him, and Gaetan cannot hide behind the fact that he was betrayed first. Jad Carradine raises the equally painful question of whether change can ever become real after blood has already been spilled. Together, these lives form no clean pattern, except one. Circumstances shape people powerfully, but they never remove the burden of choice. Perhaps that is the cruelest balance in this world. The continent creates damaged men and then punishes them for being damaged, yet it also refuses to let damage become absolution. Witchers are taken young, transformed through pain, taught to survive creatures ordinary people fear, and then sent into a society that often despises them until something starts scratching at the door after dark. That history explains bitterness, loneliness, and the temptation to sell a blade wherever coin is offered. It does not make every killing inevitable. The moral weight of the Witcher survives precisely because inevitability never becomes complete. And this is why Ciri carrying the cat medallion matters so much. She does not purify the symbol, and she does not erase the dead who wore it before her. Instead, she proves that inheritance is not destiny. She carries the elder blood without becoming only what emperors and elves expect from that blood, just as she carries the cat without becoming whatever frightened villagers expect from that emblem. You can be shaped by what came before without being sentenced to repeat it. So when you think of the cat school after all of this, perhaps do not picture a hall of assassins or a line of failed witchers disappearing into darkness. Picture instead a series of crossroads, each one reached by a different man carrying the same small piece of metal. One chooses anger, another friendship, another survival, another repentance, another sacrifice. The medallion remains almost unchanged while the lives beneath it move in completely different directions. That is the quiet truth the cats leave behind. Symbols can carry history, but only choices carry responsibility. And now the road returns to Honorton, where evening has deepened and the last light is fading from the timber walls. The village is still. The blood has gone dark. And somewhere inside that silence, one child is alive, because even in the middle of slaughter, one final line was not crossed. You can hear the wind moving softly through the empty yards, lifting dust where footsteps once passed. For a moment, the cat medallion catches the dying light, then the glint disappears, and the village is left to the dark.